lifting up Jesus, opening His Word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
Good for the world. Together we feed, clothe, and educate desperate people. We nurture and sustain fragile peace in conflict areas throughout the world. And we hold outlaw regimes accountable. We do this because it represents who we are. It is our American way. But we'll be honest with you. When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. In the case of the United States, we are asked to pay more than anyone else for that dubious privilege. Unlike in some UN member countries, the United States government is answerable to its people. As such, we have an obligation to acknowledge when our political and financial capital is being poorly spent. We have an obligation to demand more for our investment. And if our investment fails, we have an obligation to spend our resources in more productive ways. Those are the thoughts that come to mind when we consider the resolution before us today. The arguments about the President's decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem have already been made. They are by now well known. The decision was in accordance to U.S. law dating back to 1995, and its position has been repeatedly endorsed by the American people ever since. The decision does not prejudge any final status issues, including Jerusalem's boundaries. The decision does not preclude a two-state solution if the parties agree to that. The decision does nothing to harm peace efforts. Rather, the President's decision reflects the will of the American people and our right as a nation to choose the location of our embassy. There is no need to describe it further. Instead, there is a larger point to make. The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit. America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do, and it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that. But this vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us in the UN. And this vote will be remembered. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is shameful for the United Nations that I must stand before you today. It is shameful that this meeting is even taking place. Jerusalem is the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people. It is the capital of the state of Israel. Period. It is a fact that simply cannot be disputed. King David declared Jerusalem the city of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago. The Jewish Bible mentions Jerusalem 660 times. Our prayers recall Jerusalem's holy name over and over again. As our Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, said, and I quote, "Jerusalem is an inseparable part of the history of Israel, of the faith of Israel." I am holding an original coin. It's from 67 AD. It says in Hebrew, and I quote, "Freedom of Zion." Look in the envelope in front of you. You will see you have a replica of the coin. It is clear evidence from the time of our Second Temple. It proves the ancient connection of Jews to Jerusalem. Our bond to Jerusalem is unbreakable. No UNESCO declaration, no empty speeches, no General Assembly resolution will ever drive us from Jerusalem. These are the facts this body does not want to hear. These are the facts this body wishes to ignore. So today, I will tell you about another unbreakable bond. The unbreakable bond of hypocrisy between the Palestinians and the United Nations. Some have cautioned that the United States' decision is one-sided and harmful to peace. The opposite is true. It is the one-sided steps of the Palestinians and the UN that have pushed away peace for years. With every anti-Israel resolution, with every attack on my people, the UN has perfected its double standard. We are now sitting in an open session, an emergency session of the General Assembly. This session has been open since 1997. We live in a world that is full of conflict and war, but only when it comes to Israel, the one true democracy in the Middle East, does this assembly remain in a constant open session. How many times has Israel reached its hand in peace since 1997? How many times have we offered the Palestinians to join us in dialogue? How many times have these calls for peace been rejected? All of us have lost count. When Prime Minister Barak offered the Palestinians a state in 2000, we were met with suicide bombers on our buses and shootings in our streets. In 2005, Prime Minister Sharon disengaged from Gaza. He removed every single Israeli home. You will not find any settlements, any occupation in Gaza anymore. Since then, we have been attacked again and again with rockets and missiles aimed at our civilians. Yet, this body was silent. The United States simply stated a fact. They officially declared what has always been true. Jerusalem has been and always will be the capital of the state of Israel. Those who support today's resolution are like puppets You are puppets pulled by the strings of your Palestinian puppet masters. You are like marionettes forced to dance while the Palestinian leadership looks on with glee. You are blind to the lies, unaware of the manipulation surrounding you, just like a puppet. This vote is nothing more than a performance of delusion. The Palestinians know this resolution is a fraud. They know this resolution does absolutely nothing for the lives of the Palestinian people. They know it won't create jobs for their people. They know it won't provide better health care for the people of Ramallah or Gaza. No, this resolution is nothing more than a distraction. All it will do is tell the Palestinians they can continue rejecting peace. And if you vote for it, you are sanctioning that view. I thank those brave countries that do not support this resolution. You have not fallen prey to the puppet show before us. You are the defenders of real peace. You are the leaders who prove that no UN resolution can rewrite history. Because when a UN resolution designates Israel's presence in parts of Jerusalem as illegal, in reality, it designates the presence of the Jewish people at the Western Wall as illegal. Mr. President, for thousands of years, Jews had only partial access or were even banned completely from the Western Wall. Other nations, kingdoms, and empires that occupied Jerusalem over the centuries had no respect for freedom of religion. But when Israel was founded, we established a strong democracy. Our democracy is based on individual freedoms. One of those freedoms is the freedom of religion. And all these years later, our democracy and our commitment to those freedoms continue to thrive. We know Jerusalem is sacred to billions around the world. Israel respects all religions and encourages everyone to visit and pray in the holy city. Mr. President, there is a particular irony with today's resolution. Countries that sponsor today's resolution accuse the United States and Israel of violating international law. Countries like Yemen, where terror groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS find fertile ground. The irony continues. In every other scenario, this body preaches human rights and peace, but not when it comes to Israel. In fact, you completely ignore the horrific acts of terror that threaten Israeli citizens. These past 2 weeks alone, I've seen 23 rocket attacks by Hamas into Israel. We heard nothing from the UN. No Security Council meeting, no emergency session of the General Assembly, nothing. The PA threatened violence and days of rage, but the UN had no condemnation. Mr. President, let me be clear. Violence and terror must never be tolerated. If this body were really united for peace, it would pass a resolution condemning Palestinian violence. This resolution only encourages more violence and instability. It encourages the Palestinian leadership to continue on this dangerous path. You permit them to pursue violence in the name of Jerusalem, the city of peace. Mr. President, Israel is an optimistic country. We returned home after thousands of years in exile. we made the desert bloom and defended our country from countless attacks. 42 years ago, this body, here in the General Assembly, this body adopted a different, shameful resolution. It equated Zionism with racism. It took 16 long years for that hateful resolution to be revoked. I have no doubt that today's resolution will also end up in the trash bin of history. I have no doubt that the day will come when the entire international community will finally come to recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the State of Israel. Thank you.
Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio. I am here live with James Jacob Prasch from Cebu in the Philippines, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends, coming to you from the Philippines this week in Cebu, and it is coming up to the Feast of the Nativity, Christmas, if you will. Jesus, of course, this time of year celebrated Hanukkah, according to the Gospel of St. John, chapter 10, verse 24. We don't personally celebrate Christmas, but we do observe the Nativity, the birth of the Messiah, although it almost certainly did not happen at this time of year. The 25th of Kislev was the Hebrew feast of Hanukkah, the feast of dedication of the temple, which is the background to John chapter 10 and also to the book of Daniel chapter 11. Nonetheless, here we are, and there you are. Let's look at This Week in Prophecy. This Week in Prophecy. This Week in Prophecy, the nations lining up against Israel, but the United States, thanks to the policies of the Trump administration and our very able and capable UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, a Native American actually, who is the present ambassador to the UN, has stood against the international tide with only 9 votes opposing the General Assembly resolution calling upon the United States to invalidate its move of its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Warnings were issued by the White House, by the State Department, and by Nikki Haley that the United States would be keeping a tab on those nations that vote against the United States in terms of their eligibility to continue to receive American foreign aid.
Thank you, Mr. President. To its shame, the United Nations has long been a hostile place for the State of Israel. Both the current and the previous Secretary Generals have objected to the UN's disproportionate focus on Israel. It's a wrong that undermines the credibility of this institution, and that in turn is harmful for the entire world. I've often wondered why, in the face of such hostility, Israel has chosen to remain a member of this body. And then I remember that Israel has chosen to remain in this institution because it's important to stand up for yourself. Israel must stand up for its own survival as a nation, but it also stands up for the ideals of freedom and human dignity that the United Nations is supposed to be about. Standing here today, being forced to defend sovereignty and the integrity of my country, the United States of America, many of the same thoughts have come to mind. The United States is by far the single largest contributor to the United Nations and its agencies. We do this in part in order to advance our values and our interests. When that happens, our participation in the UN produces great good for the world. Together, we feed, clothe, and educate desperate people. We nurture and sustain fragile peace in conflict areas throughout the world. And we hold outlaw regimes accountable. We do this because it represents who we are. It is our American way. But we'll be honest with you. When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. In the case of the United States, we are asked to pay more than anyone else for that dubious privilege. Unlike in some UN member countries, the United States government is answerable to its people. As such, we have an obligation to acknowledge when our political and financial capital is being poorly spent. We have an obligation to demand more for our investment. And if our investment fails, we have an obligation to spend our resources in more productive ways. Those are the thoughts that come to mind when we consider the resolution before us today. The arguments about the President's decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem have already been made. They are by now well known. The decision was in accordance to U.S. law dating back to 1995, and its position has been repeatedly endorsed by the American people ever since. The decision does not prejudge any final status issues, including Jerusalem's boundaries. The decision does not preclude a two-state solution if the parties agree to that. The decision does nothing to harm peace efforts. Rather, the President's decision reflects the will of the American people and our right as a nation to choose the location of our embassy. There is no need to describe it further. Instead, there is a larger point to make. The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit. America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do, and it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that. But this vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us in the UN. And this vote will be remembered. Thank you.
This has also been applied even more broadly beyond that scope, saying that the UN itself is being overfunded by the United States, and there were further complaints issued by Ambassador Haley concerning the continual bias of UN resolutions against Israel. We have heard the normal rhetoric of nonsense and the litanies of lies that we've grown accustomed to, speaking about the illegal occupation. In fact, on the basis of international law, a UN resolution has no basis in law. International law is determined by treaties. Violating those treaties determines illegality. They simply redefine what is legal and what isn't based on the politically expedient definition. Most disappointing this week has been old Mother Europe in its usual hypocritical cowardice. Again, we have warned about the government of Theresa May, the woman who almost put the Labour Party back in power, her neck being saved by the Northern Irish Unionist parties. Theresa May, somebody who was pro-Remain, who opposed Brexit, being the British Prime Minister and the President head of the Conservative Party, despite the fact that the British people voted to leave Europe and voted for Brexit. There we have a pro-European, anti-Brexit Prime Minister. This same Prime Minister is, of course, in league with Barack Obama and John Kerry in his last act of being pressured by him or encouraged by him to vote against Israel and UNESCO, saying that Israel has no claim to the Wailing Wall, to the Kotel, or to any biblical or historical sites on the basis of historical claim. This was Theresa May voting with the Muslim world against Israel. And of course, the judgment of God fell very quickly upon her when she almost lost the election. And the conservative majority was decimated under her failed leadership. Well, she has continued her anti-Israel policies, voting against the United States and against Israel. This week, what is supposedly America's closest ally in Europe, at least. And, of course, she has done this to placate the Islamic interests, the same Islamic interests that have been responsible for the bout of recent terrorist attacks in the UK, in Manchester, in London, the stabbings, the driving on the sidewalks, etc., etc. Yet she continues to pander to radical Islam, which is essentially what her vote in the UN did. It is impossible to separate radical Islam from the opposition to the removal of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Ironically, some of the more moderate Islamic states, particularly the ones who control the most petrol wealth. Today, the foreign minister of Bahrain from the Emirates, certainly the Saudi Arabians, and last week, a major figure in Kuwait, have all downplayed the significance and importance of Jerusalem in Islam and in current political dialogue. This would have irked the Palestinian Authority and the more radical Muslims, such as Iran, considerably. Nonetheless, we do see that there are the oil states who have the most economic leverage and political clout because of the oil, who are not in opposition to Mr. Trump. 35 other countries abstained, not wanting to go against the United States. Unfortunately, Angela Merkel, who has seen Islamic terror in Germany and who was determined to import more of it, apparently, by wanting to increase Arab Islamic immigration into Germany by at least 1 million so-called refugees who should be going, in our opinion, to Islamic Arab countries, has voted against Israel. So again, the nation that gave the world the Nazis, the Third Reich, and the Holocaust is going back to its own Jew hatred, placating Islamofascism. We've seen this in courts' decisions in Germany, exonerating Islamic radicals and terrorists who have attacked synagogues. We've seen it in the policies of the German government, applying Hitler-era laws, Nazi laws against Christian homeschoolers, which the Obama administration refused to give immigration status to the United States in his own war against Judeo-Christian values and private Christian education. Ms. Merkel has now again voted against Israel, joined, of course, by France and by Italy and by Greece, the European NATO powers. As we speak, Islamic immigration of so-called refugees who are not going to Arab countries, who are not going to Muslim countries, but who are crossing the Mediterranean, are coming into Greece. They're coming into the Aegean, to islands like Samos, and they're coming to Italy and into Sicily and working their way north. It is our prediction, based on Genesis chapter 12 and other passages of Scripture, that God is going to bless the Trump administration for its stance. And it's going to ward off the judgment of God against the United States that the Barack Obama administration tried to bring on America with its anti-Israel vote, recognized by such people as Alan Dershowitz and other leaders of the otherwise liberal Jewish American community. The knife in the back to Israel, as it was described in essence by Mr. Dershowitz, was indeed put there as the last act of his presidency, but certainly Mr. Trump, Mr. Pence, and Ambassador Haley have pulled it out and have made public mention of the treachery of the Obama administration in regard to UN policy towards Israel and American policy within it concerning the UNESCO vote. Again, Mr. Trump has stood nobly and bravely. Whether we like him or not, we must continue to pray for him and thank God for his stance. It can only bring blessing to America, but what has happened will only bring a curse to Europe. There will be further Islamic terror against France, against Germany, against Britain, and against the other countries in Europe who have cursed Israel. in order to placate the same radical Islamic interests that have perpetrated so much terror against Western Europe already. It is impossible to separate Islamic Palestinian nationalism, so-called, from the general tide of Islamic terror involving everything from Abu Sayyaf to ISIS to Al-Qaeda to Hamas to the Muslim Brotherhood to Hezbollah, and it will come home to Europe once again, thanks to the European leadership in Germany, in France, and in Britain, as well as Italy and Greece. America has stood alone, but the Lord has stood with Israel and will stand with America because of Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and other passages. It is easy to see, once again, how the stage is being set for Zechariah chapter 12, 1 through 10. So it goes. More to be said concerning this. I do think it is advisable, once again, for the United States to close its diplomatic liaison mission with the Palestinian Authority and to close the Palestinian Authority office in Washington. Mr. Abbas has denounced Washington, said it's no longer a viable partner. The American taxpayer should not be giving money to the Palestinian Authority, nor should they have any kind of diplomatic recognition or representation in Washington. It's time to close down their liaison offices and stop funding them. Let them get the money elsewhere. Let Germany pay for it. Let France pay for it. America should not. I do hope the United States will withhold economic aid from those countries who have voted against it, except where it is in American interest to supply military aid to countries such as Egypt. Otherwise, economic aid should be withheld. I hope Mr. Trump makes good on his warning, and that the United States reduces its funding of the United Nothing, also known as the United Nations, the UN. It is high time for this to happen. That has been this week in prophecy, but this is ongoing. The predicted riots and violence have largely not happened on a grand scale. Nothing like that was anticipated, nothing. Part of the reason for this is because of the Emirates and the Gulf states, the Gulf oil states, who control so much of the political leverage with petrodollars, have not taken exception to Mr. Trump's actions. They've not done it. They've not sought to placate the Palestinian Authority or anyone else. Again, the normal hypocrisy we see in the UN. 500,000 people killed in Syria by the Syrian government, backed by Russia and backed by Iran, 500,000. Yet Israel is being singled out for human rights abuses because of its actions. It hasn't done anything except defend itself. Again, more hypocrisy upon hypocrisy, and Herr Merkel and Theresa May, and of course Mr. Holland, doing their normal kneeling down and licking the boot of Islamic interests. Thank God that America no longer has a president in the vein of Obama or people like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, that it's standing the way it is. May it continue by God's grace and mercy to do so. Again, we urge prayers for Mr. Trump. No, he's not perfect. No, we do not always agree with him. One area where we continue to disagree with him is his policy towards the Kurds. Iraq voted against the United States after over $1 trillion in aid and military aid being given to Iraq. This is our payback. We have stated repeatedly, the only people in Iraq who America or the West can at all trust are the Kurds. They should not be sacrificed for the sake of good relations with Turkey. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, of course, voted against the USA. He is one of the instigators of the resolution. We should not think of him as a friend. He will never be a friend. He is somebody perhaps we are in bed with by way of mutual convenience. He's a NATO member, but the role and mission of NATO needs to be redefined in the post-Cold War era. So the story now continues. Across campuses in America, we have seen Islamic professors from Islamic and Middle Eastern study centers funded with petrodollars from the Gulf, giving their usual radical and anti-American speeches. Again, it is unfortunate that such people are even given visas to enter the United States as academics. I hope the next action by the American State Department will be the curtailment of academic visas for professors who are in bed with any kind of Islamic radicalism, even though they are friends of the lunatic fringe of the American left. This week in prophecy, we have seen further examples of this. In the Silicon Valley, dominated essentially by establishment Democrats, people who espouse liberal values concerning same-sex marriage and the like, have given money once more to the Council for American Islamic Relations, despite the fact that this funding given by the Silicon Valley Community, given by the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, is going to CAIR, irrespective of the fact that CAIR has been promotional of Sharia and of proponents of Sharia that calls for the execution of homosexuals, that is guilty of the suppression of women's rights, that is certainly anti-Semitic, that is often anti-American, that does all of these things that are in theory antithetical to the goals and values of the American left. Pursuing these policies that are in theory antithetical to the values and goals of the American left. There is a lack of reason, a lack of coherence, and why you would fund an organization that is anti-women in its support of Sharia, that is anti-homosexual in its support of Sharia, that is certainly anti-Semitic, given the fact you have people like Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, and these other people in the Silicon Valley who are Jewish. Why are they involved in funding these left-wing causes? Or mollycoddling people like Linda Sarsour, who has condemned the victims of forced genital mutilation in Islamic countries. She condemns them, not those who forcibly perform clitorectomies on these underage girls. Again, the hypocrisy and the illogicality of the American left and of the establishment of the Democratic Party, where so much of the funding comes from, not only Hollywood, but now Silicon Valley. It has happened once more this week in prophecy, with funding going to the Council for American Islamic Relations. That same council that is an unindicted co-conspirator 3 times for funding Hamas, a terrorist organization, according to the U.S. Justice Department. Yet they get money from the lunatic left, from the liberal idiocracy of California. And there are Jews involved in providing the support. Insanity upon insanity. At least Mr. Dershowitz seems to be half awake. Let us continue this week in prophecy. The Islamic Relief Organization has likewise been designated as having terrorist ties, yet still receives funding from the American left. Almost impossible to make any sense of people who speak of women's rights, of same-sex marriage, of homosexuals being discriminated against, and who will align themselves and financially back fundamentalist Islamic interests, who are not only antithetical, but militantly antithetical to those same values they espouse, to say nothing of the anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. Yet, what kind of sense comes from the thinking of people in San Francisco anymore? I have no idea. Let us move on this week in prophecy. Going to London, England. It is publicly disclosed this week in prophecy that the chairperson of the Memorial Committee for the Grenfell Towers fire that took place in North Kensington in London, literally a towering inferno, in which probably between 2/3 and 3/4 of the victims were Muslims, is Tahara Ahmad. Her anti-Semitic statements calling the Holocaust of the Jews a holocaust and blaming the Jews for the ownership of the Grenfell Towers, when in fact the towers were owned by the Labour Party-controlled local council, is publicly known. Yet in a city with an Islamic mayor who has told the people of London and Britain they need to get used to Islamic terror as a way of life, the way it's normal in the Muslim world, has this terrible person as chairman of a committee. It is interesting that Goldman Sachs and other Jewish-connected financial institutions have been financial contributors to the victims and to the relief efforts for the victims. Yet anti-Semitism comes into play, and the Jews are blamed for something of which they have had absolutely no connection. This is continued. Demonstrations in London against the Trump administration's recognition of Israel as the capital of Jerusalem and moving the embassy have included public chanting together with the organized left. In Arabic, they were saying, the army of Allah will come after you, the Jews, referring back to the time of Muhammad, when Muhammad's army, the army of Muhammad as it was known, in Mecca and Medina, performed or perpetrated their first jihad and their first pogrom against Jewish victims. It is a historical fact that the first victims of Muhammad, once he waged jihad, were the Jews. And they are chanting it is going to happen again. Again, this brings us back to the doctrine of taqweed in Islam, where you have permissible lying, where in fundamentalist Islam, a Muslim is allowed to say they believe in peace, but they use the term hudna, not the term salim. When they say peace in English, they use the word peace. When they say the word in Arabic, they mean a temporary ceasefire until they can get the strategic advantage to knife you in the back, to do what Muhammad did in his onslaught, the first victims, the first targets of which were the Jewish community. Islam has a long memory, and that is what is being chanted this week in prophecy. We are reminded of something else that's being chanted. Hine lo yanum velo yishar shomer Israel. He who keepeth Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. We are seeing the judgment of God on the Islamic world and on the Arab Muslim world already. In Syria alone, 500,000 Muslims being killed by the Syrian government. This is only the beginning. Of course, Christians have also been driven out of Syria and Iraq. Nonetheless, the overwhelming number of those killed and made refugees have been other Muslims. This will continue. This week in prophecy, some Jewish youths, Orthodox Jewish young people, were arrested for praying on the Temple Mount. This is not an illegal act under Israeli law. They were instead charged with disturbing public order. The Israelis have bent over backwards and been unusually tolerant of displays of Islam, have been unusually tolerant of Muslims conducting prayer services that have offended public order, often incited by radical preachers, speaking of Al-Aqsa and of the Temple Mount, Har HaBayit. But when it comes to Jews, the Israeli police cracked down immediately. The youths were later released. Again, the political pressure on the Israeli government to pander to radical Islam is not something that is peculiar to what we see in Europe. Even the Israeli government does it. No Jew and no Christian should be arrested or prevented from praying on the Temple Mount. The holy sites should be open to all people of all faiths. Again, a politically selective enforcement. If there's going to be politically selective enforcement, it should also be selectively applied to Muslims, not just to Jews, and certainly not to Christians. We have seen Christian groups, pilgrim groups, Bible study groups on the Temple Mount being interfered with the Waqf, with the Temple Mount Islamic authorities. Again, when you go down to the Wailing Wall, any Christian can pray at that wall. As soon as you go up to the Temple Mount, the Islamic authorities prevent Christians from worshiping on the Temple Mount. There needs to be a crackdown on the Waqf. For this mess, we may thank the late General Moshe Dayan, who illegally trafficked in archaeological artifacts. That's how he became personally wealthy in the estimation of many Israeli researchers and journalists. He gave the Temple Mount over to the hands of Islamic authorities in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, and we've been stuck with that mess ever since. It would be far worse if the government of Jordan did not have a hand and a say in it by international agreement. But it does show the following. Oslo II is a mistake, and it's dead. It never should have happened. It testifies to the folly of the foreign policy of the Clinton administration. It should be absolutely declared null and void, as it's been already functionally abrogated by the Palestinian Authority, going back to the time when Yasser Arafat himself was alive, a man who was invited to the White House by the Clintons, and then launched a series of terrorist attacks against school buses, bus stops, and so forth, killing thousands of people, Arab and Jew. This was Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn. Oslo II is dead. There is no partner for peace with the Palestinian Authority. The only ones who can represent Palestinian Arab Muslims are either the Egyptian government, speaking on behalf of Gaza, which it used to control, or the Jordanian government. But there is no partner for peace that is in any way viable, even for dialogue, other than those Arabs who have made peace with Israel and with whom Israel has diplomatic relations, that is Jordan and Egypt. Nonetheless, this week in prophecy, this is what has been transpiring. Let's move on. This week in prophecy. Major events have happened in Europe and are continuing to unfold as we speak. Regional elections in northeast Spain and Catalonia have voted overwhelmingly in favor of the separatists against the Spanish government of President Roger. It has placed him in a very precarious position, politically and practically. It has given momentum this time that the last election did not, because the last election was boycotted by many pro-union residents of Catalonia. This time was an open election. There were no boycotts. All parties were able to run candidates, and overwhelmingly, the regional government of Catalonia voted in favor of the separatist parties. The EU is having a problem, making the iron stick to the clay. Not only can they not make nations as they exist stick together effectively in the aftermath of Brexit, but they cannot even make nations that are members stick together. We are seeing the breakup of Spain. We are seeing the breakup of other countries in the EU along ethnic lines, at least incipiently. Certainly, Ireland comes into play as the second place in question. The Republic of Ireland being still in Europe, Northern Ireland being part of the UK, and being Brexit. What you see happening this week in prophecy in Spain is highly, highly significant to Daniel's vision. Now, we go back to the last tradition once again, the last historical link we have with the teaching of the apostles, according to Papias and Hegesippus, was the line that went from the apostle John to Irenaeus via Polycarp. According to Irenaeus, the apostle John taught the Antichrist will ascend to power. He will come to power when the iron and clay do not adhere, when the countries in the Roman Empire begin breaking down and cannot adhere. In desperation, they will turn to somebody who can seem to hold it together. No doubt the stage is being set for Antichrist. Thank God America is uncoupling from Europe in diplomatic respects, as we saw this week in the UN. This is a good thing. But what else is happening this particular week in prophecy? The Apostle John also said, according to Irenaeus, that the three kings that are put down, one is Libya, one is Egypt, and one is Ethiopia. That is the land of Cush. Now, the land of Cush did not simply mean Ethiopia as we know it. It meant Black Africa, which then was the Horn of Africa. The entire area we call Ogaden, Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, that entire region, and Sudan. With the backing of the United States, of Europe, and of Israel, a Christian nation was created in South Sudan following the genocide of over 3 million Christians by Afro-Islamic militias. Once that nation was established, however, a power fight took place along tribal and other lines. Some following the president, some the vice president, fighting each other, creating an avalanche of refugees from South Sudan, flooding into Kenya, flooding into Uganda, and spreading north. We have also seen refugees from Eritrea and from Somalia attempting to get through Egypt, and some of them even arriving in Israel. Again, the stage is being set for the dawn of the Antichrist. We don't speculate about a time frame or about individuals. We simply point out that the constellation of events in the Middle East and in those nations is in line with what Daniel said would happen. And if Irenaeus is to be believed, and we cite him as a historical source for many things, including John's authorship of Revelation, it is acutely conspicuous what is happening and who is coming. Yes, Christ is coming, but before he comes, someone else comes and counterfeits him on a white horse. That is the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist of the book of Revelation, chapter 6, chapter 13, etc. This week in prophecy, we see it happening in Spain, we see it happening in Europe as a whole, and now we see it happening in the Horn of Africa. This week in prophecy, we have seen the death of Francis Cardinal Law, the Irish-American cardinal who was exposed publicly and who left the United States under a cloud thanks to the protection of his personal friend, the late Pope John Paul II, and given a promotion to Rome as the Archpriest of Santa Maria Maggiore, a cathedral owned by the Vatican in Italy that is known for putting Mary on the cross. It has an actual crucifixion scene of Mary being crucified instead of Jesus. He was, as Mary died for our sin, he was given the position as archpriest of this huge cathedral. I've been in it several times. When he had to leave the United States due to the spotlight exposure by newspapers in Boston. Again, the film Spotlight documents with Hollywood acting the account of what actually took place that saw Cardinal Law having to leave the country. A man who criminally conspired to protect pedophile Roman Catholic clergy over a number of years at the expense of not protecting the children. This has been a particular embarrassment for the Irish-American community and for the Irish people. Although these sex scandals have been global, they've been in Brazil, they've been in Italy, they've been in Spain, they have been certainly in Austria. The largest seminary in continental Europe was the scene and the site of the largest seizure of pedophile pornography in history, 40,000 hours of film alone in this seminary, where Roman Catholic seminarians were being groomed by priests how to molest children. And it was known by the cardinal. in any sense a phenomenon of any one country, but it has particularly affected Ireland. In Ireland, every single prelate, every single Roman Catholic bishop in every diocese in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland has been caught protecting pedophiles. It has not only been priests, it has been the Irish Christian Brothers, a clerical order of non-priests, and it has been the so-called Sisters of Mercy in the Magdalene laundry scandals, again documented by a major film of which 34,000 Irish girls who were victims gave testimony. It was always suppressed by the De Valera government and by the governments of the Republic of Ireland. It was kept out of the dial, but eventually it has come to be known. The role of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the Republic of Ireland. But it crossed the Atlantic with major Irish American clergymen at the forefront, specifically Cardinal Mahoney of Los Angeles and Cardinal Law of Boston, who is now dead and standing before the judgment seat of Christ. He was protected by John Paul II, who was canonized a saint. I suppose he's the patron saint of pedophiles. Child molesters prayed to him for protection, since that's what he did when he was alive, but they made him a saint. This was John Paul II. He was the benefactor of Cardinal Law. Well, Cardinal Law may have gotten away with it in this life, where he's standing now before the judgment seat of Christ. He will not get away with anything, and either will his benefactor, John Paul II. The Lord Jesus, before whom he stands now in judgment, said, "It's better to have a millstone tied around your neck and be cast into the sea than to hurt a child." He got away with it because of the corruption of Massachusetts Democratic Party politics. He got away with it because of the politics of the Bush administration and Condoleezza Rice. He got away with it because of the politics of the Vatican. But he's now run out of string. There was never the admission of criminal activity there should have been. Certainly not the repentance there should have been. Now it's too late. We shall all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Thank the Lord that he died for our sin. May he give us the grace to continue to follow him. But these religious hypocrites will get away with nothing. This week in prophecy, this tradition of Irish Catholicism that even in our own lifetime has seen scandal going back to Fulton J. Sheen's rivalry with Francis Cardinal Spellman in New York, is not new, but again, it was always suppressed by the media and by politicians and by district attorneys' offices. But it's come out, and it will continue to come out. There was nothing honorable about Francis' law, and there's nothing honorable about those who honor him, such as Pope Francis. Nonetheless, that has been this week in prophecy. We're seeing it in the Roman Church. We're seeing it in Europe, in Catalonia. We're seeing it in the Horn of Africa. We're seeing it in Israel. We're seeing it in the United Nations. We are seeing it everywhere, and we will continue to see it. Yes, Antichrist is coming, but that is only the prelude. Jesus is coming soon. This is Jacob Prasch coming to you from Cebu in the Philippines. Have a very blessed nativity. Let us remember why Jesus was born. He was born to take my sin and yours, to die our death in order to raise from the dead and give us his life. He took our sin to give us his righteousness. Salvation does not come from its vote. It does not come from rituals. It does not come from sacramental regeneration, not from sacraments, not from rituals, not from any church or institution or denomination. Salvation only comes from the Lord Jesus Christ. For this purpose he was born, to die our death, to give us his life, to take our sin, to give us his righteousness. That is the meaning of the Nativity, and it is a picture of his return. Have a very blessed Nativity. May the Lord bless you. All being well, we'll be speaking to you next week from my native New York City. God bless, and as we say in Hebrew, Hag Molad Sameach, and Happy Hanukkah. God bless.
So the UN is considering a resolution concerning President Trump's recent decision to move our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Upon hearing this, the Trump administration has decided to cancel the move. I kid. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley tweeted this. At the UN, we're always asked to do more and give more. So when we make a decision at the will of the American people about where to locate our embassy, we don't expect those we've helped to target us. On Thursday, there'll be a vote criticizing our choice. The U.S. will be taking names.
Love it.
Taking names, you gotta love that. It's politics meets The Godfather. I'm shaking. So Haley shows us what American foreign policy looks like with a spine. For so long, we've endured a relationship with the UN that verges on spousal abuse. No matter what we do, save lives, help those in need, try to pull violent countries out of their own deadly chaos, the UN then kicks us in the teeth. It's nice to see Haley hit first and hard to counter the coming petulant whine, and whine they will. After all, it's our embassy, not theirs, so shut up, you ungrateful brats. And I hope we do take names and make these double-parking dipwads pay. They're always double parking. So the good news for America, there isn't just a new sheriff in town, but a new contagious sentiment. One that mixes no BS bluntness with a disgust for what went on in the past. The new boss is definitely not the old boss, and now the UN must deal with it, not the other way around. Amen. Thanks, Greg. You're welcome. Hey, so this is a letter. I think we just upped. It's Haley's letter to delegations.
I see that.
Yeah, very good. Shall I read the first sentence?
Sure, I'll take it.
Okay. As you consider your vote, this is my favorite sentence. As you consider your vote, I want you to know that the president and the United States takes this vote personally. This is like an action hero memo. Now it's personal.
I don't know. Yeah, I like to separate the politics from the personal, but she's making a strong case there.
Yes.
I saw somebody anonymously say from another country that her letter only served to unite them more.
Oh,
but the thing that's interesting
them.
is that as soon as President Trump made the announcement that he was going to seek to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, remember there was going to be this parade of horribles and all these terrible things were going to happen, and pretty much has fizzled. And even if they use it as an excuse to riot or to commit acts of terror and try to blame it on that.
Yeah.
But they've been doing that
Yeah,
for
it's
years.
hard to distinguish one day of rage from all the other ones.
Well, it was cold weather that night, and so they didn't want to go out and protest that night. That's how heartfelt it was. Look, if you go to Israel, you actually, in Tel Aviv, you see the embassy, but then you go to Jerusalem, and we have a consulate, and then we have two people. So we already have a physical facility there. It's a reflection of reality, and it's actually been the U.S. policy for decades.
Yeah.
And the candidness in which President Trump is projecting this, and Nikki Haley is communicating this, is something that Americans have felt like for a long, long time. It is not a brand new position, and it is the right reflective position.
She reminds me of Jean Kirkpatrick. Remember her?
Yeah, she was great. You know, Juan, when Nikki Haley becomes the first female president in 2024, will you see this as the pivotal moment that pushed her to the forefront?
Oh, it could be.
Because right now,
because what we
Hillary's
know
now
is
home weeping.
the current president likes bully language that you might say is analogous to, you know, the mob and the Godfather, I think was what you said.
I was going to go with Goodfellas, then I went with the Godfather.
Yeah, but I must say it does resonate, that kind of language, you know, I'm taking names, I'm counting numbers. I mean, come
Dirty
on.
Harry, Magna Force.
You know what you had here? A UN Security Council vote. 14 of 15 countries voted to say this is wrong. They didn't like it. And then you have Haley saying, hey, what about our friends, people we give money to? Britain, France, oh, they're voting for. What about Putin? Even Putin is saying this is nuts.
Even Putin.
And you know what? You said, oh, this is American policy. How come President Bush didn't do it? How come President Obama didn't do it? How come President Clinton didn't do it? How come the first President Bush didn't do it?
We can answer that, but we can't say it on television.
So basically, they voted against the United States, then they got in their car and double parked in front of their escort service.
Well, I just think the key here is, are we going to be able to, down the road, broker what no one has been able to do, but try to bring some peace to the middle. That's the goal here. It's not to just show off and do chest thumping.
The previous tone has not worked, Kimberly. I like this new tone.
I totally agree. I think that's enough already. And we know what? We're tired of getting ripped off. Whether it is that, you know, Paris Climate Change Accord, we got to get rid of that. Okay, now, in terms of these countries that are all always putting their tin cup out for the United States to give them money and billions in aid, I'm with the President of the United States and with Nikki Haley. Cut them off.
Can I?
Dry
we
up
do
the
that
well
though
of money.
for other diplomatic reasons to give them money. I mean, part of it is stability in other regions.
Do we have time to show that Trump tape of him talking exactly what you're saying? Or are we out of time? Go. Let's do this. This is funny.
I like the message that Nikki sent yesterday at the United Nations for all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us. Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot. We don't care. But this isn't like it used to be, where they could vote against you and then you pay them hundreds of millions of dollars and nobody knows what they're doing.
He's just like your uncle. He's like your uncle at Thanksgiving. We don't care. They don't do anything for us.
He's a businessman. The point is, there is no incentive for them to try to go with the United States and show some solidarity and support for something that shouldn't be that difficult for them to wrap their head around. So instead, we keep rewarding bad behavior and complete disrespect with more money. Why do we do that? Why do we do it?
You know what, though? Wasn't it just last weekend Nikki Haley was in trouble with Don Corleone when she said the women should be heard who have something to say about him? Oh, but now Nikki's popular.
No, that's the way it works. It runs hot and cold. That's the beauty of the most transparent administration in history. You know when people are in trouble and when people do well. Why would you complain about that? You know what? I'm tired of this segment.
The Council is now ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2017/1060 please raise their hand? Thank you. Will those against? Thank you. No abstentions. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to the members of the Council who wish to make the statement after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have been the proud representative of the United States at the United Nations for nearly a year now. This is the first time I have exercised the American right to veto a resolution in the Security Council. The exercise of the veto is not something the United States does often. We have not done it in more than 6 years. We do it with no joy, but we do it with no reluctance. The fact that this veto is being done in defense of American sovereignty and in defense of America's role in the Middle East peace process is not a source of embarrassment for us. It should be an embarrassment to the remainder of the Security Council. As I pointed out when we discussed this topic 10 days ago, I will once again note the features of the President's announcement on Jerusalem that are most relevant here. The President took great care not to prejudge final status negotiations in any way, including the specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. That remains a subject to be negotiated only by the parties. The position is fully in line with the previous Security Council resolutions. The President was also careful to state that we support the status quo regarding Jerusalem's holy sites, and we support a two-state solution if that's what the parties agree to. Again, these positions are fully consistent with the previous Security Council resolutions. It is highly regrettable that some are trying to distort the President's position to serve their own agendas. What is troublesome to some people is not that the United States has harmed the peace process. We have in fact done no such thing. Rather, what is troublesome to some people is that the United States had the courage and honesty to recognize a fundamental reality. Jerusalem has been the political, cultural, and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people for thousands of years. They have had no other capital city. but the United States' recognition of the obvious, that Jerusalem is the capital and seat of the modern Israeli government, is too much for some. First, some have threatened violence on the street, as if violence would somehow improve the prospects of peace. Now today, buried in diplomatic jargon, some presume to tell America where to put our embassy. The United States has a sovereign right to determine where and whether we establish an embassy. I suspect very few member states would welcome Security Council pronouncements about their sovereign decisions, and I think of some who should fear it. It's worth noting that this is not a new American position. Back in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was the American president, the Security Council voted on Resolution 478, which called upon diplomatic missions to relocate from Jerusalem. The United States did not support Resolution 478. In his remarks, then Secretary of State Ed Muskie said the following, quote, "The draft resolution before us today is illustrative of a preoccupation which has produced this series of unbalanced and unrealistic texts on Middle East issues." Specifically regarding the provision on diplomatic missions in Jerusalem, Secretary Muskie said this, quote, "In our judgment, this provision is not binding. It is without force, and we reject it as a disruptive attempt to dictate to other nations. It does nothing to promote a resolution of the difficult problems facing Israel and its neighbors. It does nothing to advance the cause of peace." That was in 1980. It is equally true today. The United States will not be told by any country where we can put our embassy. Buried even deeper in the jargon of this resolution is the accusation that the United States is setting back the prospects of peace in the Middle East. That is a scandalous charge. Those who are making it should consider that it only harms the very Palestinian people they claim to speak for. What does it gain the Palestinian people for their leaders to throw up roadblocks to negotiations? A peace process that is damaged by the simple recognition that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel is not a peace process. It is a justification for an endless stalemate. What does it gain the Palestinian people for some of their leaders to accuse the United States of being hostile to the cause of peace? It gains them nothing, but it risks costing them a great deal. The United States has done more than any other country to assist the Palestinian people, by far. Since 1994, we have given over $5 billion to the Palestinians in bilateral economic assistance, security assistance, and humanitarian assistance. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees operates schools and medical facilities throughout the region. It is funded almost entirely by voluntary contributions. Last year, the United States voluntarily funded almost 30% of UNRWA's budget. That's more than the next two largest donors combined. And it's vastly more than some of the members of this council that have considerable financial resources of their own. I'll be blunt. When the American people see a group of countries whose total contributions to the Palestinian people is less than 1% of UNRWA's budget, when they see these countries accuse the United States of being insufficiently committed to peace, the American people lose their patience. I have been to the Palestinian refugee camps the United States supports with their contributions. I have met with men, women, and children there. I have advocated on their behalf. I can tell you that their leaders do them no favors by being more open to abandoning peace negotiations than to doing the hard work of seeing them to completion. The United States has never been more committed to peace in the Middle East. We were committed to it before the President announced our recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we're committed to it today. What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten. It's one more example of the United Nations doing more harm than good in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, for the simple act of deciding where to put our embassy, the United States was forced to defend its sovereignty. The record will reflect that we did so proudly. Today, for acknowledging a basic truth about the capital city of Israel, we are accused of harming peace. The record will reflect that we reject that outrageous claim. For these reasons, and with the best interests of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people firmly in mind, the United States votes no on this resolution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States of America.